think there's very rare opportunities, especially in the Canadian market, to build a brand from the ground up. Like even when I was working at Ogilvy, it was so exciting to be working on Dove because they're this global brand. But that's just it, right? They're a global brand. So a lot of times you were doing adaptation work as opposed to like really being able to get your hands dirty and being like monumentally involved in like the decision making and the business aspects.
Welcome to another episode of the Growth League podcast. I am your host, Caleb Clark, and I have the privilege of speaking with Caitlin Benn today, who is the Director of Marketing at Wild Harrier. Wild Harrier is interesting. It's a Montreal-based pet food company that's doing things a little bit differently. Caitlin, what does that mean, doing things a little bit differently?
Yeah, so we definitely take a different approach to dog food. So all of our dog food and treats are made from what we like to call unusual ingredients with extraordinary benefits. So they're not your typical chicken, beef, or lamb proteins. We use proteins that are both really good for the dogs from an allergy standpoint, but also really good for the environment. So we're using things like crickets and black soldier fly. We're using invasive species like Asian carp. And we also use a bunch of upcycled ingredients like fruits and vegetables and spent grain from leftover from the brewing process.
Wow. I'd love to hear more about that story, and I'll ask you some more about it. Caitlin, a quick background about your journey as a marketing leader, as a marketer, even functionally, and what brought you to Wild Harrier? What attracted you to the opportunity?
Yeah, I have quite an eclectic background in marketing, I would say. I probably took a little bit of a different journey from a lot of other marketers that you've spoken with in the past. I've really tested the gamut of marketing communications. I started off my career in PR, focusing on fashion and beauty, dealing more so with events and kind of media relations, switched gears and went ad agency side. So I was fortunate enough to work with Ogilvy and Mather in Toronto. So it was definitely the breeding ground of my marketing expertise and the best training I think I've ever received in the marketing space.
No doubt.
And then I went client side and went to go work at Bell, working both on their Marcom team and then switching over to their sponsorship team, which actually brought me out to Vancouver for a year, and then came back, stayed in sports marketing for a while, and then really went into more of a product management, product marketing role in the tech space, which was like a huge departure from what I had done previously. Yeah. And now I've ended up at Wild Harrier, which honestly, taking over that marketing team, it's a culmination of all of the things that I've done in the past. And I'm actually really fortunate that I got to try out every facet of marketing communications because it's really culminated into this one experience and being able to bring that expertise into what I'm doing today and being able to just, source the team that I need, both internally and externally. So it's been kind of fortuitous in that way.
Interesting. So the way you're running the program at Wild Harrier and the way you're managing the team, it's sort of a mosaic of different experiences you put together from agency side, client side. That's really interesting. Did you have the opportunity to kind of blank slate it when you got to Wild Harrier, or?
Yeah, completely, which has been an amazing challenge, but definitely a challenge. There's the upsides and the downsides for sure. I came in at a point where they had just gone through a visual rebrand. And so I was starting off with this package of brand new assets from a visual identity standpoint. But there was still a lot of legwork that had to go into defining who we were and that brand personality. And I kind of wish one had been done before the other, but it was kind of retrofitting, like, okay, we've got this new look and feel, but what does that mean for us? Like, who are we? What do we want to be saying? Et cetera, et cetera. So I got to come in and help to build out that tone of voice, that personality, and then also kind of have been in a interesting position of having to kind of go back and fix some foundational marketing cracks and build a solid foundation while simultaneously trying to grow the business. So it's been an interesting juggling act of having to do both. And especially in a small startup environment, you have to pivot kind of every 2 seconds. So juggling the two levers has been interesting.
That's fantastic and very exciting. I guess a worthy cause, right? And that's what a lot of us as marketers and marketing leaders are looking for. When you talk about having to go in there and remedy some of the foundational things, what's an example?
Yeah. So, for example, I would say even some things that we would consider the most basic, right? But even looking at our email marketing, seeing what we were and were not doing there, fixing some flows or introducing net new flows, and just making sure that we had a cadence going that made sense for our business, for our product portfolio.
Right.
Taking a look at our digital strategies from like a paid media standpoint, looking at our ad spend across Google and Facebook, trying to figure out like what the right mix was, what should be focusing on.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself was super interesting. I did a digital marketing certificate through BrainStation in Toronto, which also was really helpful coming into this role because I am not myself a growth marketer. I come more from a brand marketing ad agency side. But having that background really helped me to have those conversations with the people that I needed to.
Right.
And, what works in a traditional category of like using Facebook and Instagram for awareness and kind of trying to gain reach that way just wasn't working for us. Dog food is a entirely different category. And so it was a very good lesson in, okay, test what should work, but then pivot to what's actually working for us and taking the learnings from those tests and applying them fairly in an agile way for sure.
When you say dog food's different, for us neophytes, we may see it as no different than any product. How is that industry or that vertical different? And when you say different, what do you mean from a ability to leverage some of the most common tactics and strategies to succeed? How is it different?
Yeah. So there's kind of two facets of it. There's the dog food and then there's dog treats. Dog treats, yes, they're kind of an impulse buy, right? Like people are more open to testing any treat out there, and especially because they want to keep things interesting for their dogs. So, when it comes to leveraging the likes of Facebook and Instagram, sure, you can get some conversions on those treats because they're fairly like low investment, low risk. People are more open to it. Dog food, on the other hand, people are very hesitant to change their dog food.
Right.
For one, people see their dogs as an extension of their family. They want to feel like they're giving their dog the best food possible. And what that often can come with is this preconception of the big guys, the known brands, and wanting to go with someone that they know and trust to be credible. So as a small startup, it's kind of hard to break into that space and convince people that, we are a credible dog food. We are science backed. We are healthy and good quality. So there's that aspect of just this lack of trust that you have to build. But also, if anyone who has a dog knows that transitioning onto a different dog food is not always the prettiest. It can come with a lot of vomiting and diarrhea and stomach upset. So when people find a dog food that works for them, they're not really inclined to change it because of fear of like how it's going to upset their stomach. So when people change a dog food, it's typically for a reason. It's because, they have a problem such as allergies or sensitive stomachs or so on and so forth. And that's when they're kind of more open to switching. So we need to be at the forefront of that trigger moment, especially because our products are hypoallergenic because of the novelty of the proteins. And so we want to be there as soon as people have that trigger moment. But beyond that, we want to be there when people just want to buy dog food. But it's kind of baby steps, right, of how we're going to kind of gain that trust from consumers. But it's not an impulse buy. Yeah,
that's really interesting and a very big challenge because, it's kind of like, it's not as easy as just getting people to shift loyalty. There's so many other components to it, such as the health component of the dog or the difficulties in switching dog food. I'm not a dog owner, but I understand that you can't just like do this one day and pedigree the next day and this one that. You have to kind of create a system. So not only is there need to be a willingness to shift loyalty if they're not with Wild Harrier, but then also there needs to be a moment in time. And how do you build the marketing system around those triggering events? That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And it's been a very steep learning curve. I've been there about 10 months now. And I've learned a lot in that time, just about how customers think. I think one of the most critical things that I did at the outset of joining was taking the time to interview our customers,
Okay.
and really trying to dig into their psyche, to dig into what their process looked like, what was life before Wilder Harrier, what led them to Wilder Harrier, after Wilder Harrier, like really trying to dive into that, to hone in on our messaging, really identify our like true product market fit,
Right.
and then taking that and applying it across all of our marcoms, and building out the right marcoms based on what they were saying too in terms of discovery.
Yeah. That was part of your first 60 days, you'd say, just kind of like jumping
Yeah,
into the knowledge seeking.
exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So, yeah, that's a challenge. I just keep thinking about how it's just not an easy shift. So anyways, good for you, and good for you for starting with, what are your current customers saying, and try to build or reverse engineer from there. Caitlin, I don't want to embarrass you or put you on the spot, but what would you say your top one or two superpowers are as it relates to a marketing leader right now, and the way you show up at your role?
Oh man.
Us Canadians, we
That's a
don't
tough
need to,
one.
we don't like to talk about
Yeah,
this.
I know. I am definitely, this is like one of those blushing moments. Yeah, I would say the first one is just this perpetual need to question why. I think that is definitely my superpower. And I think it has been even from when I started my career, and, not having the confidence, not having the background. I think it's this constant curiosity of why we're doing what we're doing, why it makes sense, why aren't we doing this? Just constantly asking those questions and really drilling down, into the why, I think has helped me to
Mhm.
really become a strategic marketer. I think when you're not able to answer those questions, if you're not able to continue pressing upon the why, then you don't have a sound strategy.
Right.
So I definitely think that has been like one of my superpowers, and not being afraid to ask those questions across departments too, just to really drill down on the business matters,
Mhm.
as well, like extending beyond just, marketing. Because a lot of times in marketing, people think you're in marketing, you do the creative, fluffy stuff, but you always forget about how deeply connected you need to be with product, with business development, with sales, really having a pulse on everything that they're doing and making sure that it makes sense and that you're supporting it in every way. So yeah, I definitely think that's one of them. Um, and then I would say that my second one is probably finding and sourcing expertise. I truly believe that you need to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you. And if you don't do that, that's when you fail. So I think one thing I've been able to do quite well in this role is figuring out what those gaps are and where my gap in knowledge is, and either filling it myself or finding the right people to put in those positions, whether
Right.
internally or through freelance partnerships. I think that's been like a crucial piece,
Yeah.
especially in a small team and startup environment.
You've established over time an ability to identify what a good partner or freelancer would look like, and a kind of a ways of working with them to facilitate the perfect marriage. Tell me about that a little.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think especially in a small startup environment, right?
Right.
You have to have the right experts in place. And I don't believe that, there's one person that can do it all. I think a lot of times in startups, it's interesting, right? Because I come from the big brand and now I'm in the small startup environment. And I think a lot of times in startup, there's this kind of misconception that you need to have a jack of all trades all the time, right? Because
Right.
you're stuck for headcount. And so you need to have someone who's in there that can just do it all. But the reality is there's a lot of things that require a specific skill set and a deep understanding to really get the job done properly. So
Right.
as an example, I have an understanding of digital marketing. I have a background in it, but I myself am not a growth marketer, digital marketer. I need to find someone in that position who can really collaborate with me to take my overarching marketing strategies and put that into action in the digital space. And to have me do that myself, sure, I could do it. I can get the ad campaigns up and running, but I just think it's so important having specific skill sets that will really help you push the needle, and identifying what needs to come first, which is always tricky, right? And I think that differs from business to business.
That mindset about surrounding yourself with experts and the right people, and that you claiming that to be a superpower of yours, like how did that come to be? Was that experiences at agency life before, or did it just?
Yeah, I would say so. Like, because at Ogilvy, I worked as an interagency team. So at Ogilvy, my main client was Dove. So I worked across Dove hair care and body wash, and we were the strategic agency lead, but we worked as an interagency network. So we had the PR agency, the media buying agency, the shopper marketing agency. So yes, we were the ones who were the keepers of the strategy, and the idea came from us. But we had to work with all of those teams in order to then build out the actual campaigns. And so early on, I got exposure to all of those experts, right? Like I got to work closely with them and kind of see their inner functionings and where they were able to flex that we weren't. So I think that exposure helped. And then even going over to a big brand like Bell, I mean, when you go, right, there's a big difference between small companies and big companies. When you go to big companies, there's a role for everything, right? There's like one person who does one or two things, whereas in small companies, you do have more of that jack of all trades. So I got to see all of those individual roles as well, and kind of suss out which ones I thought could be kind of combined versus which ones were critical. So yeah, definitely think it was experience and across all the jobs that I had.
Well, I think that the team at Wild Harrier is should be very grateful for the experience you've gained over this wild history as it relates to B2B, B2C, big agency client. And what a fun opportunity to have a blank slate and a kind of build your own based on that experience. And so strengths being asking why as many times as you can to, I think that can be a scary thing sometimes, because we could have a great idea and we know that on the third or fourth why, the business case may not be there. And do we have the guts to throw out the idea? Actually, this is a more personal, not a personal question, but a question I have is that I've struggled with is when digging through the why funnel, and just asking a bunch of times, sometimes I have a hard time not having it come across as like being overly aggressive and poking holes and being very micromanagement type thing. How can you shape the why funnel in your team and with the groups you work with as a really good strategic process, and that should be embraced? What's your approach?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely is hard, especially when you are in an agile environment where testing is like the theme of the day, month, year, right? Like you have to test things. And I think whenever we hear the word test, there's this knee-jerk like yuck reaction almost, because you fear that you're just like throwing something against the wall and hoping it sticks. I think that why process is super important when you are looking towards those tests, to make sure that you actually have a hypothesis in place that you're hoping to glean insights from. Even if the test fails, at least you're testing a hypothesis that will give you some real data, right? So I think that's kind of where the questioning comes into play, is as you go down that funnel, even if you don't have all of the answers to the why, if at least can be tied back to that fundamental hypothesis that you're trying to get answers from, then you know that it's kind of passing that, right? It doesn't have to be perfect, but so long as it ties back to that and you feel confident that you'll get something rich out of it. I think that's kind of the balancing act that you have to play, is not confusing having the perfect answers to that why, but just making sure that it does tie back to that original hypothesis that you're looking to test.
That makes sense. And I think kind of how you answered it for me is that in the absence of a hypothesis that's sort of co-created amongst the team, then asking why can come across as not intended sometimes, like, well, why? But
exactly.
if you initiate from a hypothesis, that is kind of the kicker there. What's an example of a hypothesis that you have formed in the past that the team has then gone and tested against and
Yeah. So for example, for us, and this was kind of in those first 6 months, the main thing we really wanted to test was from a messaging standpoint, from a product value prop standpoint. So our company has kind of two sides to it, right? There's the sustainability side,
right.
and then there's the fact that we're a nutrition company, right? For dogs. And the business grew out of this desire to be a force for change and really that sustainability mission.
Okay.
However, the hypothesis that I wanted to test, especially just in terms of listening to our customer service team, kind of hearing some rumblings from customers, was historically we had positioned ourselves more so from that sustainability lens. But I had a sneaky suspicion that that was not the decision-making factor for our customers, that it wasn't the sustainability story that was making people choose us. It was really the health benefits for their dogs that was making people choose us. And that was something that became very critical in those interviews and conducting some surveys. It was honestly a critical turning point for our business, because it was through that we really did hone in on what our value proposition was and where our product market fit was. Right. And there was kind of a hesitation towards testing that, right? Because the business's mission is around sustainability and changing the food system and creating this brighter future for future generations.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we had to kind of check that idealistic mindset at the door a little bit and kind of take a step back and really ask ourselves the question, okay, but why are people buying us and why are they staying with us?
Right.
And that really created a shift in terms of our messaging across all aspects of our marketing channels.
And, it's hard enough to form hypothesis or start with a hypothesis with established companies, but with startups, when you're so close to the date of origination, to ask a question that's incongruent with how it was originally founded is a
exactly.
tall order and a kind of a bold ask, right?
Yeah, and sustainability as a whole is a tough topic right now, right? Because there's so much greenwashing and there's so many companies who are pursuing sustainability initiatives just to kind of jump on that bandwagon. So how do you establish yourselves as a leader in that space without sounding too preachy, without feeling like you're part of this greenwashing movement? And that was another thing that was really interesting is we felt, and we continue this today, is for us, we want sustainability to be table stakes, right? Like if you don't hear about us and our sustainability initiatives, that's okay, because that's just what we're doing.
Right.
It's just part of our ethos, right? So it's kind of a tricky one though, because a lot of people, you want to broadcast it and sing it from the rooftops, but we are just very selective about when and where and how we do say that, because we don't want to be preachy. And at the end of the day, it is really our dog's health that we want people to come to us for. And the fact that we're sustainable in everything that we do, we hope will be a bonus and value add that people will connect with.
That's awesome. What are you weak at? What's one of your weaknesses that you have to rely on others for that you're also self-aware of, obviously?
Yeah. I think I have too high of standards. It's definitely a weakness, especially in a startup environment. Like I was saying, you do have to be agile, right? And you do have to move quickly. I think because I was trained agency side where you're dealing with really tough clients, and if your work doesn't hit a certain level, it's just not getting out the door and you're getting shut down. So that's how I was trained. Has always been my mentality. The problem is in a startup environment, when you are a small team and when you've got a lot of things going on, sometimes you really have to hone in on what your MVP is, right? Like what is good enough to be put into market. And I struggle with that because I have that standard and I want to make sure that I'm checking off all the boxes. So I have a hard time letting go at certain points and saying, you know what, this is good enough and we'll just improve upon it. It's definitely been a struggle in this type of environment.
That would be a big challenge, right? Because it's like for things that we care about, when we know that we're shipping something that isn't as good as it could be, it's almost like an attack on our identity.
Yeah, completely. And there's things that like realistically, when you take a step back, you're like, my customers won't notice this, but you do, right? And it seems so crucial in that moment to you. And sometimes letting go of that and just saying like, you know what, it's fine, is tough to do.
So with really that, I imagine, based on what you told me about your perspective on testing and, better to try than fail, have you been able to frame the idea of sending something out that isn't as good as I think it could be? Does it make it easier for you to overcome that weakness? Because you're like, this is by design, we're trying to send it the MVP style so that we can gain that data and grow from there? Or how do you?
I mean, sometimes, if I'm being totally honest, I think it's one that I still to this day, like I'm getting better and better at.
Okay.
And I think it's been working with the right partners to find, to push me as well, right? I need people around me who are not just going to take what I say and necessarily run with it. I need people who are going to challenge me too, right? So I'm fortunate enough that I have found those partners who are like, okay, Caitlin, but do we really need this? Like, is this one that we can let go on?
Yeah.
So having those people to challenge that has been super helpful and has kind of opened my eyes to things that can or can't be let go. But it's definitely like a constant it's a constant learning.
Okay. Well, let's put that back on the shelf. We don't have to talk about it. So partners, you've referenced that a couple of times. What is I asked earlier, but I want to ask again, what is your either learned way or your approach to facilitating really, really good, meaningful, fulfilling partnerships? What role do you play? What are you looking for in a partner? What are some no-fly zones for you? Tell me about how you shape this so that it's a positive and effective experience.
Yeah. So I think even just starting from the beginning in terms of sourcing those partners, I rely very heavily on my network. I think word of mouth and just kind of hearing from people's experiences of who they've worked with in the past is so crucial and has been really beneficial for me. So that's always been my starting point in terms of sourcing who it is that I'm going to be working with. There's a lot of people that I've crossed paths with in the past who I hold on a pedestal in their domains. And so I'll often kind of tap into that network just to see who they would recommend. So I think that's kind of the first piece. But in terms of the relationship itself, I mean, for me, that transparency and honesty is like by far and large the most important thing that you can have in any partnership relationship that you have. I think there's sometimes especially having come from an agency side and seeing it, sometimes you have this knee-jerk reaction of like, okay, gotta just like say and do whatever the client says, and I have to just make sure that they're happy all the time. But for me, what's really important is finding those partners, like I was mentioning, who will challenge me back and who will work with me as opposed to for me. And I think that is pretty crucial in making sure that you're actually like doing great work and pushing the business forward. I don't want a bunch of yes, ma'am, people who will just like take what I say and run with it. Of course, there's a little bit of that to an extent, but I really do want it to be collaborative, and I want them to be honest when they feel that something's like moving in the wrong direction or they're having a second thought that's like questioning what we're doing. I think that's super important.
Yeah, that foundation of trust allows you to achieve things that are meaningful, right? And go after things. And even I would imagine, based on what you said, even if a partner or freelancer was to say, hey, Caitlin, we screwed this thing up and here's what we learned and here's what we got to do. And let's get back on track type thing.
Exactly. I think it's super important. And I think early on too, it was interesting because I am from Montreal originally and I moved to Toronto. And I remember once, and it stuck with me forever, there was someone I worked with who kind of were chatting and they laughed at me one day and they're like, oh, I find it so funny how your work personality is the same as your like out of work personality. And I was so taken aback and was like, what? That's a thing? Like people have this dual personality. That's so bizarre. Like it just didn't make sense to me. But to be honest with you, I think that has like stood to me really well in my working relationships because I'm just who I am. I'm very real. I'm just going to be myself in every communication. So I don't know. I think that's kind of like helped in terms of a relationship management too, because there's no facade, right? It's just, I'm trying to strive for realness. And I hope that people do the same with me as well.
Oh, that's great. Work-life integration, right? Not balance.
Also, it sounds exhausting having two personalities.
Yeah, no, it really does. You got to take this hat off and put this one on. No. What just in case there's anyone listening that shares some of the same challenges, I'd like to understand what is currently one or two of your biggest challenges that you're kind of going to the drawing board, working with the team to figure out, whether you figured it out or not, or you're in the progress or it's done. I'd love some experience sharing on what's keeping you up at night now, in case somebody else is listening.
Yeah. We have a big job to be done in terms of raising our brand awareness. We have a product that once people know us and have switched over to us, they love us and stick with us. And we really have clients for a very long time. But the problem is that not enough people know about us. In an ideal world, I would love to have a marketing budget where I'm able to have kind of that 60-40 split between upper funnel, lower funnel, and kind of have that full marketing mix built out. The reality is our budget environment in a small startup is always in flux. There's times where we're on an upward trend. There's times where we have to pull back those budgets. So budgets is always the biggest challenge, right? Yeah. Can I build out the marketing funnel the way I want it to? Unfortunately, no, right now. And I'm having to kind of really hone in the budget I do have on those lower funnel tactics. But then you're talking to this small pool and you're not growing that pool. So trying to raise brand awareness on a shoestring budget is definitely what's keeping me up the most at night. I think one of the things that I'm exploring the most right now and hoping to build out a little bit more is really leaning on other brands and finding partnerships, finding other brands that we can work with who have like-minded audiences, who, they themselves too are at a point where they're looking to build their awareness, so we can cross-collaborate, create those unique giveaways, those programs, sharing each other's email lists, really just looking for that symbiotic relationship with other brands to kind of expand that pool in a mutually beneficial way. I think that's going to be really critical for us in the coming months, just knowing what our budget constraints are.
Right. That point that you just made about the challenge being we're a startup, we have no budget or, shoestring budget. So I'm curious about, when does the budget come? Does it come either through succeeding and just hitting home runs with limited budget, or does it have to come with a raise, or when does that story end for startups? You know what I mean? Because it's always the story, well, we got a shoestring budget, so but then do you risk not growing? And so tell me about that based on your experience.
Yeah, I think it's also changed a lot in the last year, right? When we look at the economy and how there's been this looming recession, I think even with startups, investments and VCs have really changed in their mindset. Up until recently, there was more of a growth mindset where VCs were concerned, and there wasn't this pressure of having to be a profitable organization. It was really about creating growth. Right. And so I think that small companies were a lot more open to what they were burning month over month in order to perpetuate that growth.
Right.
Unfortunately, now with the economy, it has shifted. And with all the layoffs that you're seeing and the sensitivities, you are seeing the demands from VCs also change, where they are looking more towards those companies that at least have, break even and profitability in sight. So I think that's also creating a little bit of a challenge at small companies of figuring out exactly what you were saying of how much are we really able to invest in this growth, which is, especially for CEOs, right, is kind of this elusive unicorn, right? Yeah. It's hard to touch it. It's hard to see it, hard to feel it.
Yeah.
So how much can we actually put towards that versus what do we put in to make sure that we're hitting that break even mandate? So it's tough. I don't think that there's an easy answer to it. I think those micro tests definitely help, but again, you're dealing with such a small sample size
Yeah.
that it's
No,
hard to
it's a tough
know
one.
whether it justifies.
You
Yeah,
know, I think that
it's tough.
yeah, totally. I think your hypothesis approach, potentially is the answer for these situations, because it's like, you can't, again, when does growth happen? Do you just wait for VC support, or do you earn it through the marketing activity you're doing? So if you have a hypothesis with a small budget and it gets proven, do you have the guts to blow the door wide open with doubling down on that budget for that system that proved the hypothesis? I don't know. Like, it's a challenge
Yeah.
with startups, because I've heard it for 13 years, right? It's shoestring budget. Well, we can't do much, but then when are you going to do it, right?
And it's a constant battle, right, too, at small startups, because I mean, I hear it in my network all the time. There's always this ongoing conversation with C-suite about awareness, right? Like,
Yeah.
awareness is such a tough subject to approach with C-suite, especially if they come from a finance background or an accounting background or just anything that's outside of marketing, right? Because you're constantly trying to fight for the idea of what can come, right?
Yeah.
It's this long-term strategy. You know, you're not going to see the results right away. You're never saying to invest in it 100%. Of course, you have to build it out with your lower funnel tactics, but just trying to explain how it all has to work together, and that there is this importance of, having to put money towards that brand building.
Yeah.
But it's a hard sell, because brand building in and of itself doesn't have those short-term ROI metrics, those immediate metrics that everyone wants to see of, like, I did X and it got me Y. So it's a constant battle. But I think the most important thing there is making sure that you're having those two-way conversations with the C-suite, right? And making sure that they're educating you as much as you're educating them, and kind of finding a meeting ground, right?
Yeah.
They have to trust in your expertise. And
that was actually the next question I was going to ask you is, regardless of the size of business, I think marketing needs to be holistic, and it needs to be a co-created thing amongst the rest of the organization, different departments.
Completely.
How do you currently integrate marketing and the activity, or the conversation around marketing, with other members of the team, the founder, other departments? How do you get integration?
Yeah, so that has definitely been one of the things that I have been working on as soon as I joined the company, because one of the things that I realized was the departments weren't really talking with one another. So it kind of felt like everyone was going off and doing their own things. They kind of had their own OKRs that they were working towards. And what's nice is, I think over time, I think I've also forced myself into the room, into some conversations, which has been helpful. But my company, everyone who works there, have been really open to it as well. So I think we've started getting better at making sure that we're, like, all sitting at the table in the one room and discussing the business as a whole, and figuring out how we work together towards aligned OKRs, as opposed to these, like, individual department OKRs, which every time we would kind of have these quarterly meetings, like, something always felt a little off about it, right? It just felt so disjointed. And it just didn't make sense. And it was kind of stretching our resources more thin than they needed to be, because of the fact that they weren't aligned. So we're constantly improving upon that. And I think this last quarter has been, like, monumental in that regards. Like, it was the first time that we really shifted gears and made sure that we had kind of those overarching OKRs that we all then went away and built our initiatives towards. And it's also forced us to have more of those ongoing conversations. Like, I have a weekly meeting with the head of my product team. I have, like, the weekly meeting, obviously, with my CEO and one of the co-founders. So just making sure those conversations are happening more regularly, to make sure that I'm abreast of what they're doing and I can provide my input. They know what's going on the marketing side, et cetera.
Yeah. No, it sounds like a good relationship and collaborative environment, which is obviously what you need. What, besides a paycheck, like, what gets you out of bed for the brand? Like, why are you excited about what's going on there, the role, where the company's going, as the sun just continues to beat my eyes? People watching must be like, what the heck is going on right now? But I can, like, barely see. Anyways. We're making
And
do.
meanwhile, I'm in the grayness. It's
Yeah.
okay. You'll balance it out for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's very rare opportunities, especially in the Canadian market, to build a brand from the ground up. Like even when I was working at Ogilvy, it was so exciting to be working on Dove because they're this global brand. But that's just it, right? They're a global brand. So a lot of times you were doing adaptation work as opposed to like really being able to get your hands dirty and being like monumentally involved in like the decision making and the business aspects. So those opportunities are, few and far between in Canada. So this was such an exciting opportunity to be part of a B2C company where I'm able to actually build a brand, grow the brand, be so involved in where the company goes.
Yeah.
So that definitely gets me excited. I mean, I have a dog. I'm a dog lover myself. So, that doesn't hurt things either, working in the area that like personally is relevant. And of course,
free dog food.
Exactly. Yeah. But no, I think also the sustainability piece and just the fact that our co-founders really do walk the walk, which is nice. It's not it's not just something that they say about, we're B Corp certified. We went after that fairly aggressively a couple of years ago. It's something that's super important to us. And for a lot of people who don't know, B Corp is like so much more than just saying, oh, we're a company that's doing good. Amazing. It's really like everything internally too, right? In terms of how you treat your employees and everything like that. So anytime you kind of see that B Corp label right off the bat, you kind of know like, okay, this company at least has like some fundamental principles that will align with my own.
Yeah, and they definitely don't just dish out B Corp ratings freely.
No,
it's stood the it's a significant rating, so that's awesome. Regardless of what's posted on the site, like what are one or two or three things that lead you to believe that Wild Harrier really has a shot at doing it?
Yeah. So honestly, I think the thing that keeps me the most motivated is week over week, we get testimonials from customers that are so above and beyond that your food tastes great. Like we're talking stories of life-changing experiences for their dogs who were on Apoquel and who were getting allergy shots on it every month, the dogs who were on the cusp of being put down. Like the stories have been wild. And then just talking about how they switched to our food and within days and weeks they saw like a complete 180 in their dogs. Their symptoms were almost fully eradicated. Their personalities just completely changed because they weren't in pain anymore. And what that's meant for the owners themselves too, just that sheer relief that they have as like pet parents. You see this harmless animal who's suffering and you feel so helpless and you can't communicate with them to figure out what's wrong, right? So it takes a toll emotionally on dog owners as well. So that alone gives me a lot of hope and belief in what we're doing, just seeing the change that it's actually giving people and their pups. So hopefully we can do that for more and more dogs.
That's awesome. One last question here. So for the startup environment, it's your first 90 days. There's a lot of marketing directors who have transitioned from agency into this environment because of it might be a matter of fulfillment or opportunity. You told me one thing about diving into your customer base, doing some research, but what are maybe two or three other things that you would recommend in the first 90 days in this scenario? As you become the marketing director or a marketing role and brand new startup, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think sitting down with each department is super important to figure out what their challenges are, what their views of the business are, what their views of the product are, almost actually challenging them to communicate what the values of the company are and what the values of the product are. Because what's really interesting from that exercise is you'll often see that there's actually not necessarily always alignment between departments on that front. And that's a problem. You want to make sure that everyone is like working towards the same thing and understands the same thing. So I think that's always a really insightful process. And just getting an empathetic view of what their challenges are to see if and how you can support that from the marketing side of things.
Yeah.
So you definitely that. I think just reading and researching as much as possible, like really taking the time to learn. I think there tends to be a knee-jerk reaction of feeling this pressure, and maybe it has to do with imposter syndrome, maybe it doesn't, but you get in somewhere and you feel like you have to start doing right away. And I think that's a mistake. Like, I think you really need to treat those first 60, 90 days as a listening exercise, whether it is those departments, whether it is your customers, doing that research. I think it is so crucial to really immerse yourself and get those and just listen and hear kind of what those recurring themes are that are coming up, what the recurring issues are, et cetera, because what that will allow you to do after the 60 to 90 days is kind of map out what the most critical issues are and what are the immediate gaps that need to be filled, or what course corrections needs to happen first. I think that it's like listening and prioritization is what you want that goal to be, so that you can actually execute appropriately.
Yeah, that's hard to do. So
yeah, because your instinct is to get in there and just start doing, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's also sometimes an expectation of that too, whenever someone does come into the role. But I think that's where, us as marketers, we need to advocate for the process. I think we need to just be very clear about what that process looks like and why it will be of a benefit to the company, and level set, right? And if you get people on board with what you're doing and why you're doing it, oftentimes they'll come around.
Thank you for sharing that. I agree with you. And thank you for being an advocate of that, because I think that marketing leaders like you and others need to keep fighting for marketing to be at the table, adopt an experiment mindset and then what you just mentioned there. So I could talk for like another hour, but thank you very much. I appreciate your time and your perspective, and I wish you guys all the best in your growth journey.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun. So
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks so much.
You bet.